Greetings, Guardians. My name is Bife here. So, normally I don't talk about sweeping issues in Destiny and I focus on the story and lore. Today, though, I think there's a relevant bit of overlap between the two, which culminates in a topic so important that it's been discussed a whole bunch of times, and that for me it has earned itself the dramatic thumbnail and title of this video. The problem isn't necessarily one that you or I will experience as the most bolted-on core players. It's something that we will be used to. It is, however, something that will affect everyone when it comes to their experience with the final shape, and to put it simply, the problem is that the final shape is going to launch lacking important narrative context. Now I know, that doesn't sound dramatic at all, but I think the actual context of the missing context is what makes it important. There's got to be a better way of saying that. Hold on. Okay, so imagine this. You're playing a game of chess. You get about 3 moves in, get up and go and get a glass of water, and then return to your game shortly after and find that you and your opponent have seemingly continued to play, even though you weren't there. Now you're a dozen moves into the game and things are completely unrecognizable. Regardless of whether you're winning or losing, whether things are good or bad, that kind of situation would understandably leave you asking, how did we get here and what happened? This is the context that'll be missing, and from here stems one of the biggest issues facing Destiny's future generally. But first, a word from our sponsors at Factor. I'm sure they need no introduction at this point, but if you're looking for a way to make your mealtimes easier, Factor is the way. With Factor meals, there's no mess and no prep. Everything is ready to eat after just 2 minutes or less. It's faster and cheaper than ordering your expensive takeaway option that you might regularly get. Factor meals can flex to fit your lifestyle too, so if you're trying keto for the first time, or if you're vegan or vegetarian, you can find something that's right for you, and there's a ton of other options on top of that. And that doesn't just extend to lifestyle choices, that also extends to the actual meals themselves. With over 34 meal options that rotate weekly and just as many add-ons like smoothies, desserts and keto shakes, you'll have a ton of variety and can keep your meals quick as well as interesting. Use my link or go to go.factor75.com and use promo code POGBIFEFEB50 for 50% off your first box. Click the link in the description or just scan the QR code with your phone. Thanks again to Factor for sponsoring this video. So, let's expand on that analogy of the chess game that I talked about and explain what happens in Destiny terms. I think we should start with Lightfall if we're really going to bring this issue to the forefront. There is a rumor going around that feels pretty easy to substantiate, which is simply that the developers were forced to essentially split Lightfall into 2 expansions at the behest of the executives. It is clear that the executives at some point said that there was so much going on in Final Shape that they needed another expansion to properly tell the whole story. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. If that is true, then what we saw in Lightfall's expansion wasn't just a prelude to Final Shape's narrative. It had taken some original story content from Final Shape and had basically created a whole bunch of other story content. The main rumor going around with regards to all this, which feels again very easy to substantiate, is that Lightfall was essentially a filler expansion that was created out of nothing and filled the void between now and the Final Shape. The rumor, which again feels even easier to substantiate knowing what I just told you, is that Lightfall was an expansion that was created with the purpose of essentially padding things out and giving a little more runway to the Final Shape. Something which meant that the Final Shape's actual content, which had been worked on for some time, was going to be delayed, and Lightfall itself was going to need to be created almost out of nothing in a much shorter development timeline. This rushed development timeline could be a topic all on its own, and I could talk endlessly about how Destiny's worst stories have arisen from rushed development timelines. From Destiny 1's vanilla story to later expansions like The Curse of Osiris, or even the earliest expansion ever, The Dark Below, there are clear signs that when you create a rushed development timeline at Bungie, there is one thing that suffers most, and that seems to be the narrative. Now, again, it should be stated that for the sake of balance, this hasn't ever been properly confirmed, to the best of my knowledge. But the concrete terms given to us by the executives at Bungie were that there was enough for another expansion. And, well, that alone, and the implication that another expansion was made, gives us some telltale signs when you look at Lightfall's content and try to determine whether it has indeed been sort of cut up and created with the intent of making filler. The most obvious and most commonly pointed out sign of this is the moment where the opening and ending cutscenes of Lightfall can flow seamlessly from one into another, almost indicating that it was meant to be the first cutscene of the final shape in its entirety. As many of you will know, and as I've made no secret of hiding, Lightfall is not considered a great Destiny campaign. Whilst the expansion delivered some staggering improvements to gameplay, and whilst people did love Strand, whilst there are some things that have gone down really well with the community, there were also some points at which it flopped in dramatic fashion. And most dramatically of all, I think, was the campaign. Yes, people will go on about the raid, but the campaign is one that is seen widely as a step back for the franchise. A franchise that had moved to complicated narratives with compelling characters, which moved back into the territory of Destiny 1's vanilla campaign, where story elements were not explained either due to a clear lack of time to explain, or simply because there was something missing in terms of the actual timeline needed for development. This was the long-lost story of Destiny 1's campaign. It had to be rewritten at the last minute, according to articles from Jason Schreier, way back in the day. However, when it comes to Lightfall, these issues seem even more painful and relevant, given that Destiny has learned those lessons for well over a decade, thanks to the archive of internet memes that was created that flooded everything back in the early days of 2014 and 2015. So it's even more painful now when you take a look at Lightfall and basic story elements like why do we care about the Veil, and what is the Cloud Arc, and what is the Radial Mast, and why does the Witness want to connect these things to each other, really aren't answered at all. With such obvious failures at the forefront, it might be very easy to lay the blame of such things at the feet of the narrative team alone. And sure, some characters, such as Nimbus, might not have exactly landed as the team had hoped, but the wider failures of the narrative here stem, in my opinion, from choices made by the Bungie executive team about how the franchise needed an extra expansion between Witch Queen and the Final Shape, and to create more runway to the story of the Final Shape. This clearly left many key story elements in a degree of limbo, and it feels obvious to see when you look at what is between each expansion: seasons. Of course, Destiny has had a seasonal model for a long time, and seasons will make up the time between expansions now. Seasonal content tends to run for 3 months at a time, 4 of them throughout each year, between each big expansion. And the horrible truth is that if Lightfall was rushed in any regard, the seasons that were created for Destiny's year between Lightfall and the Final Shape also suffered because of this. Whilst the narrative team has delivered a full year's worth of seasonal content past Lightfall, there have been clear ups and downs. Season of the Defiance was the first season, and it suffered from a simple disconnect. The Witness's forces were seemingly capturing civilians for no discernible reason, but for a distraction. There was no ominous reason as to why, it was simply being done. And Amanda Holliday's death, which was probably one of the most important moments of the entire season, isn't regarded as a great moment of story like Cayde 6's is, much as it's had a sizable impact on the story. Even with some of the best voice talent in Destiny delivering some of the most stunning performances around that moment, it just didn't feel as punchy or poignant as it could have. It felt like a curveball sent out of nowhere, some arbitrary note that someone in this expansion had to die for the sake of some kind of narrative punch, a punch which soundly didn't land. Season of the Deep was received in a time when the player base was actively looking for Bungie to right the ship, and could have turned hostile very easily. Whilst the season finally offered an explanation of Lightfall's core elements and even the origins of the Witness, it was widely seen that this moment, excellent as it was, arrived far too late and should have been a part of Lightfall's main story. That has poisoned the well of any greatness that it might attain, and in reality, that has now left it in a place where it will never have the same gravitas that it could have. Chief amongst the explanations that were missing from Lightfall was that of the nature of the Veil, and we did see more context around the Veil thanks to the Veil containment logs. They would provide a great amount of deeper lore and some interesting voice-acted moments, but sadly, most people have never seen them. And the reason why is tragic. It's because when you open Neomuna, the map marker isn't immediately in view. You need to scroll to the very bottom left of the screen for it to even appear, meaning that most players will never be able to locate it and will never have interacted with Veil containment at all. Very few people will have seen it in its entirety, and the answers that it gave, again, were too late. Season of the Witch was actually viewed pretty favorably by the player base, but it's also clear that the interest in the narrative was dwindling somewhat. The epic showdown between Eris, Savathun, and Xivu-Arath could have been presented with a few more cutscenes to flesh out the story, but this was still clearly the best season of the year, narratively speaking. A season that went back to some of the strongest roots of Destiny's story, the monarchical conflict of the Hive. Eris Morn, the brilliant lone survivor, set out against them with nothing but indomitable will and tenacity unmatched by even the Hive. And us at the center, sitting there and wondering about the moral ambiguity of it all, sitting and having to engage in dark rituals despite technically being risen in the light. This was some of Destiny's strongest thematic storytelling as well as its best, and it could have helped to write the narrative entirely. Sadly though, this was a season that was undercut by the news of layoffs at Bungie, which were conducted by the management in an exceedingly cruel fashion, given that many developers were only given a day's additional benefits due to the time of firing being tactically aligned with the ending of certain benefits and contracts. It also occurred right before the holiday season, leaving many developers high and dry at the toughest time of the year. To say that Destiny's player base has been hostile with Bungie's executive team ever since would be accurate. Into that atmosphere launched Season of the Wish, the last season of the year and what will be the longest running season in Destiny's history, which, with about 3 or 4 months left on the clock, is still going, and yet the story has finished. Season of the Wish saw the return of Riven of 1,000 Voices and the revival of Destiny's dragons, the Ahamkara. On paper, this season could have been a slam dunk narratively. I mean, it's pretty hard to get dragons wrong, and Riven is one of the most beloved raid bosses of all time. But sadly, my honest opinion is that the Season of the Wish was actually not that great, and the chatter online has sort of pushed it in that direction too. There are fascinating themes that it plays with, there are interesting story ideas, and even the hook of the Ahamkara is compelling. And yet, all of this, the entire story of Riven, felt more like a distraction than a necessary chain of events leading to the final shape, something that was absolutely necessary. In a certain sense, this is what I feel about almost every season this year. They have all been distractions in one way or another from the overarching narrative that we simply needed to find our way into the portal as quickly as possible. Even in moments where they were technically taking steps towards that aim, the seasons felt meandering. Whilst it's nice to sit there and see an excellent story like the Season of the Witch come out of all of that, I'm still sitting here frustrated that all this time we've seen the portal overhead and we haven't been able to go into it. But the problem that I wanted to talk about at the beginning of this video is not just these seasons and the fact that they are not as good as some of the seasons of the past. This is not a Season of the Chosen or Season of the Splicer in terms of its narrative. This is not going to give you the same incredible ending that you saw at the end of the Season of the Seraph. That is not the issue I want to discuss today. The issue instead is the fact that this is the context I was talking about at the beginning of the video. And the problem is that that context is disappearing. Destiny players will be familiar with the way that Bungie's live service content functions. At the end of each year, a new expansion is added. Whilst dungeons, raids, and all the content from each expansion often stays around, Forsaken and much of the vanilla Destiny content from Destiny 2 has been removed thanks to the much-lamented sunsetting of older content. However, the seasonal content that runs through each year comes and goes in Destiny as well, sort of like a sunsetting process at the end of every year. something which means that that content is never accessible again after its removal. It means that a wealth of Destiny's content is never to be seen again and is absent from the game after a period of just a few months. That same process is going to happen when the final shape launches. This year's worth of seasonal content will be removed, including the seasons of Defiance, the Deep, the Witch, and the Wish. This is going to leave players with nothing but Lightfall as a lead-in for the 10th year of Destiny and the end of Bungie's first saga in this franchise. The major problem with this is that Bungie has staked a lot on a ton of players actively engaging with the seasonal content of this last year in preparation for the final shape's release and so that they can be caught up with the story. This content was not only meant to engage players by addressing key feedback, but it also contains key narrative moments that explain important parts to the story, in particular the origin of the Witness, how we access the heart of the Traveler, and what the Veil really is. All these points are addressed in the seasonal content, but quite notably, they are not addressed in Lightfall. Lightfall is the bit that's staying. The seasonal content, which actually gives the important context you need to understand the final shape, is being removed. If you don't play it before the final shape releases, you will miss out on it entirely. Removing this content from the game is going to leave players confused, frustrated, and unable to understand some of the key elements of the final shape's narrative as we head into the final shape itself. This is the context that is going to sting the hardest for the final shape. For the narrative to land, the major gap between what was shown in Lightfall and the understanding of what it left us with is going to need to be bridged. That was bridged thanks to the Season of the Deep and the Season of the Wish in particular. However, those seasons are being removed, and so the gap is about to return. It must be bridged again. Veteran Destiny players will know that it'll be an issue for a lot of them personally, because not everyone is able to keep up with the story. It's esoteric, it has twists and turns, and there are elaborate details that not everybody understands. In order to keep up with it, you need to be able to play the content, and you need to be able to understand the strange and intricate nature of Destiny's universe. However, this is only exacerbated if you're a new player, and this is where I need to talk about how this moment is going to even further impact two of the bigger issues for Destiny at large, two of the longest running issues for this franchise, which is new player onboarding and player retention in general. Returning to the chess analogy at the start of the video, imagine a scenario as I described it once again. We go for 3 moves of chess each, and then you leave for a glass of water, and you return to the game, and now it's the 12th turn, and you've no clue how we got here and what happened. Now imagine the same situation, but you've never seen or heard of chess. That gives you an idea of the problem that the final shape is about to have. This, I think, becomes an adequate demonstration of the issue facing Bungie. Player onboarding is going to be made even tougher. The content we have is not only focused on players who already play the game, but it also disappears on a semi-regular basis, thus robbing new players of the context needed to catch up. This system has persisted in Destiny for years, and has helped to stymie the comprehension of the story ever since its inception. For a few years, Destiny has been able to brush off some of these criticisms, especially in the year leading up to the Witch Queen, when the story was at its absolute best in the seasons, and the interest in its conclusion had never been more focused. However, even back then, this was a problem. Now, though, we approach the most important expansion, arguably in Destiny's entire history. We're left with the simple conclusion that this system of removing the seasonal content year on year has harmed the game to a degree that I don't think can be fathomed. But that same harm is about to be unleashed on new and returning players for another year, potentially in the most important year of Destiny. They are going to be dropped into an environment of great confusion when they boot up Final Shape and are expected to know the context of the last year. This includes basic questions that I've mentioned before. What is the Veil? How did we follow the Witness into the Traveler? What is the Witness's final shape? For that matter, what is the Witness? These are questions people will not have the answers to anymore. This will be the problem. This will sink the final shape story if it's allowed to persist without solutions. And at current, I think there are two solutions that seem obvious to this. Excuse me so much if you're on the Bungie narrative team. I need to discuss this, and I'm going to sound like a bit of an armchair developer here. So my greatest apologies, because I'm well aware that neither of these solutions are easy, not just from the sense of actually completing them and getting them done, but also from the sense of development requires management to actually agree to the concept. So I'm so sorry that this is probably going to lead to only further frustration, but I think it needs to be mentioned. Because ultimately, I want this video to appeal to them, so that they can actually make a correct decision. If we're going to see this problem not arise, and if we're going to start to stem the tide of things, I think we need to address two potential solutions, one of which I'm very hopeful that we'll see, and the other, I think we're going to need to actively demand as a community. Firstly, what I expect we will see is that we'll get a brief cinematic recap of the important story details ahead of the final shape. This has happened a little bit with the introduction of timeline reflections into the game, and past expansions such as the Witch Queen have made cutscenes in the middle of their story that have explained the deeper aspects of their lore quite adequately. But I think it needs to be something that all players have access to before we even set foot into the Pale Heart, and that everyone has access to after this is said and done. The game I always point to for an example of this being done correctly is StarCraft II. Whilst Wings of Liberty and Heart of the Swarm relied on players knowing the context of the original game and its Brood War expansion, the final arc of the story, known as Legacy of the Void, started with a 5 or 6 minute cutscene that recapped the entire wider events of the story all the way from the very first game leading up to the story's final chapter that you were about to play. It introduced all the necessary characters, introduced the core ideas of what was going on, and made you aware of the factions within the universe that you were going to interact with. When introducing the more specific elements of the narrative, Legacy of the Void went even further, and did an excellent job of ensuring that players were actively aware of the antagonist and some key elements specific to the faction you'd be playing as by including a 3-mission prelude campaign. This is something that is extensive, and it will give you the idea of what you're facing when you go into that main campaign. Needless to say, something like that isn't going to happen. The development timeline in front of Bungie is vanishingly small in game dev terms, and whilst to us players 3 or 4 months feels like an eternity, in actual game development timelines, 3 to 4 months is next to nothing. But if Bungie wants everyone to start vaguely on the same page, they should opt to consider at least creating a cinematic that plays before any of this that will allow players to get a grasp of the situation, the characters, the stakes involved, and what we're about to face as we go up against the Witness. The second solution, which I think is far less likely, is that we need some of the seasonal content from this year to remain in the game after the final shape launches and the Year of Lightfall has ended. This is something I'd want to see done generally when it comes to other years of seasonal content and future years of content with Destiny's new episodes. I think it should stay around, but I'm also well aware of the fact that doing anything this close to the launch of an expansion is unbelievably tricky in game dev terms. So the proposal that I would have is to simply cherry pick the bits that are important. And before I go on to that, I think that generally speaking, this is another big thing that I'd want to see changed. I'm not the first person who's mentioned the absolute tragedy that some of Destiny's best moments are lost to the past, and that they're simply now moments where you had to be there. When I want to go back and remember the magic of Halo 2 or 3, I can go and play the Master Chief Collection. In a terrible pinch, I can even just take my old 360 and boot that up and play them on their original discs if I need to. But the Destiny content that we had in Seasons years ago has been lost to the seasonal churn that refreshes every single year. The content lost to sunsetting in general is almost certain to never see the light of day again. It's insane to me that we're potentially entering the final chapter of Destiny's story, and some of the best moments that led to that chapter are completely inaccessible. the scheme where Savathûn took control of Osiris for a whole year, the moment where we saw Saint 14 return from the Infinite Forest after hundreds of years of absence, the arrival of the Black Fleet and the second sundering of the Warmind, the destruction of the Almighty over the Last City and its heroic crash down into the countryside around, the moment where Crow chose to save Zavala's life and was forced to reveal himself in the process, meaning that he had to put his trust in someone who might well have chosen to kill him. The moment where we learned about the tragedy of Zavala's now deceased family. The final brave sacrifice of Rasputin in that moment of desperation during the end of the season of the Seraphs. The moment where Saint and Mithrax defended their people side by side. And the first time ever meeting Savathûn the Witch Queen in the Season of the Lost. All these moments represent some of Destiny's strongest and most memorable storytelling. And they are lost to the player base forever, existing only in YouTube videos and archived on hard drives like mine for later reference. This last year of storytelling might not have been some of the most spectacular in every regard as the years that came before, but it still has moments worth remembering. Crow and Zavala's eulogies for Amanda Holliday, the moment where Crow describes her as being like a sunrise, the ascension of Eris Morn into the hive god of vengeance, Savathûn's secret at the heart of the Imbaru engine, and her return into the story of Destiny after she was killed, and Sloane's return to the light in spite of Xivu Arath's controlling hatred. These moments are worth remembering, but there are also moments in these stories that provide that essential thing that we've been talking about all along: context. At bare minimum, I think we need to get a series of newly refreshed timeline reflections ahead of the final shape that stay in the game long past the arrival of the final shape. One of a deep dive mission that leads to Arsa's cutscene where she explains the Veil and the origins of the Witness. A second, which allows players to replay the final mission of the Season of the Witch and the Imbaru engine, thus giving context to the 15th Wish. And a final one which takes us through Riven's lair and allows us to see us rescue Riven's final lost egg, before allowing Crow to enact the 15th Wish and jump into the Pale Heart ahead of us. These timeline reflections miss a lot. They miss the greater context of the story of Xivu Arath. They miss the Vanguard and the Guardians at large being shown yet again that Eris Morn can be trusted even in the most dire of circumstances. They miss the whole context behind who Arsa is and how Sloane found her. But they give players just enough information on the nature of the important story beats that will be relevant to the final shape. And whilst I want to see every important and meaningful moment in the story preserved, for the sake of understanding what the game needs to be in a healthier state, I think those 3 moments are the most important that need to be targeted to be kept. I first talked about this topic early on in 2023 when the Season of the Deep cutscene released. Whilst I think the major takeaway from that video was that it was released far too late and should have been a part of Lightfall, the other thing that I mentioned at the time was this. I knew and stated that in the space of just a year, everything we'd just seen that was so important to the overall narrative of Destiny, to its greatest villain in the form of the Witness, and to the story of Lightfall, an expansion that was chronically missing any kind of explanation of its major story elements, would be gone within the space of a year, maybe less. By the time this video is published, the Final Shape's original release date is only days away and the options available to Bungie are severely limited. As I've said a few times in this video, 3 to 4 months worth of development time in game dev terms is vanishingly small as far as windows of opportunity for Bungie to utilize are concerned, but they absolutely must utilize them if they haven't already. No matter how great the final shape might be, it'll inevitably be tarnished if its narrative is incomplete due to an understanding that isn't there. Thanks to the nature of Lightfall and the way that it refuses to answer essential questions in its own plot, I believe it is not a worthy introduction to the story of the final shape. Bungie has decided to expand the story of the final act of Destiny's 10-year saga into 2 expansions. That much is clear. But in doing so, regardless of whether this was done to create another expansion as filler or whether it was made so that they could tell the full breadth of the story The full breadth of the story is no longer available to everyone as they play through it, because the seasonal content that contains some of the most important parts to it will be gone. This is why I believe that Lightfall is not enough, and why I think that it will not be a worthy introduction to the story of the final shape. If future generations of Destiny players are stuck around asking what the Veil is, that will be the most enduring proof of that notion, and it will be the most damning testament to the poor nature of that decision, which, regardless of how you slice it, was made by the executives and not the narrative team. If Bungie wants to give the final shape its best shot at success, it must bring as many people along for the ride as possible. Destiny is in vital need of new blood, and it needs its veteran players to return with the promise that the game they loved is being managed responsibly. More importantly, that practice of removing story content needs to be examined in the future. As Destiny continues onward and more content is created, Bungie needs to think of long-term solutions to the bloat that originally caused them to think of sunsetting content in Destiny as a solution. Whatever solution they come up with, it's clear that it needs to be incorporating the simple lesson that the alternatives to sunsetting are clearly better than what has gone on in the game. There are precious few games in the MMO and live service space that have actively removed content in this manner, and I think that the state of Destiny has shown an adequate reason as to why many will refuse to attempt this approach in the future. Hopefully, the worst possible damage to all of this can be prevented ahead of the final shape, but for many, the damage has already been done. It started with the removal of the Red War campaign, with the removal of Io, Mercury, Titan and Mars as destinations. It continued with the vaulting of the Tangled Shore and the Forsaken campaign, which returned Destiny to prominence. It persists still with the removal of every year's worth of seasonal story. The world of Destiny is designed to be a changing and active place, but it has also consistently buried its past, leaving its player base confused, be they veteran or new. It has left itself hobbled, and as it continues to grow its legs back after every sunsetting endeavor, the next one comes along and cuts it off at the knees yet again. Hopefully you all agree. Regardless of whether this was an issue with the seasonal model or live services generally, the truth remains the same. For Destiny to flourish, Bungie cannot keep burying the past. Context is important for the future, and if we don't have access to it, if people aren't able to play it even in the most basic of regards, then Destiny's story is never going to be truly understood or appreciated, even in its moments of greatness. That is something that I hope we can avoid. Either way, that's the end of the video today. Hopefully it was informative. If it is, and if you agree with the message that I'm putting out here about the nature of how seasonal content refers to the future of the game and yet doesn't stay around for players to experience it, please go ahead, hit the like button so that you can register your agreement. In addition, if you have your own thoughts down below, go ahead and leave them in the comments section, and if you are interested in more content regarding the narrative and the story of Destiny, as deep and as wide as it can be, please go ahead and hit subscribe, and the bell next to subscribe. But as per usual, know that your viewership as always was quite enough for me, and that in the meantime my name is Byf. Rodacia ad Astra. I'll see you Starside.